Hi, my name is Ivan Thomas, Executive Director here at DETV, and we have partnered with ChristianaCare and the Franklin Institute to bring you this amazing program this evening. Did you know clinical trials are key to ensuring that new medicines are safe and effective? Racial and ethnic minorities have historically been underrepresented in clinical trials and continue to be for reasons ranging from access to mistrust. As medicines rapidly advance, it's increasingly important to close the diversity gap in clinical trials to tackle current health disparities and ensure marginalized communities can benefit from the medical breakthroughs of the future. However, barriers to participation remain, and sustainable solutions are long overdue. From the ethics of designing research to new strategies for improving reach and access. Now, meet these amazing individuals actively working on solutions for a more equitable future and hear perspectives gathered in advance from the community at large in a special live event tonight, moderated by Franklin Institute's own Chief Bioscientist, Dr. Gayatri Das. Tonight's panel includes Dr. Eric Kmet, Director of the Gene Editing Institute at ChristianaCare Health Systems, Jacqueline Crawford, ChristianaCare Health Systems nurse and participant in cancer research, Dr. Anya Harry, Global Lead Clinical Trial Diversity at GlaxoSmithKline, Holly Fernandez-Lynch, Assistant Professor of Medical Ethics, Perelman School of Medicine, University of Pennsylvania. Now remember, this event is totally interactive, so please type your comments in the comment field. Now let's get started.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Gayatri Das, Chief Bioscientist from the Franklin Institute, and I'm so thrilled that you're joining us for this conversation tonight. It's an honor for us to be partnering with ChristianaCare Health System and DETV tonight for this conversation where we hope we can get you the information you need to make choices about participating in medical research and advocate for your health in ways that can benefit everyone. At the same time, it's a conversation. And we hope that the scientists and researchers on our panelists today, as well as those listening online and on TV, will have a chance to hear your comments and concerns and questions so that we can all work together to improve the systems that we have in place. So let me introduce you to the panelists that I'm really excited to be here in the studio with, thanks to the CDC's newest guidelines and getting vaccinated. This is the first conversation that I think I've had with people in person.
What a good feeling.
In a long time. Yeah, it's great. So Dr. Anya Harry, Director of Clinical Trials Diversity from GSK.
Thank you.
Jackie Crawford, you're a cancer survivor, and we're going to come back and get to know each of you a little bit better.
Thanks.
Dr. Eric Kmet, Director of the Gene Editing Institute at ChristianaCare. And joining us remotely is Holly Fernandez-Lynch, who is a professor of bioethics at the University of Pennsylvania. So as we get started, I'd like our audience to get to know each of you a little bit better, to hear the perspectives that each of you bring to the conversation. So Eric, let's start with you. You are one of these researchers, scientists who is on the front lines of developing new therapies. Tell us a little bit about what your research is about.
Yes, well, it's been a really exciting couple years, obviously, for those of us who are in genetic medicine, because we've finally evolved a series of tools that we think can help in standard of care. Genetic medicine sounds kind of imposing and challenging, and tonight we'll probably get to a point where we can talk a little bit about removing some of the myths and some of the hesitancy there is around using them. My work is basically to develop innovative tools for the treatment of certain kinds of cancer. We currently have a program walking through the FDA toward a clinical trial using a remarkable genetic tool called CRISPR. So our day jobs are essentially to make sure that it works effectively and safely. And we do that at the Helen F. Graham Cancer Center at ChristianaCare.
So your research is on a path towards what we in the business called clinical trials.
Right.
And that's a term that may or may not be familiar to folks. I think, we've all gotten a little window into medical research over the last year.
Right.
But can you give us the quick nugget of what a clinical trial actually is?
Sure, and you know, it's a great question, Jatri, because I think there's a lot of misperception, not only culturally, but even within the general population, what clinical trials are. It sounds so sterile, clinical trial.
Right.
It's the wording, and I was interested in talking with Jackie not too long ago, but maybe we could change the language and soften it a little bit so we don't get so imposing. But clinical trials are essentially processes where we begin to evaluate healthcare in patients. And we're all very familiar with the big cancer drugs and the heart disease drugs and diabetes drugs. We call that a treatment trial. But there are also clinical trials involved in prevention, and prevention of certain diseases as cancer could be something as interesting as a clinical trial to see if you ride your bike 2 days a week. Do you feel better? Do you reduce your heart disease capabilities? Or even trials that involve taking vitamins or fish oil or something that augments a trial. There's also one that I think we need to really sort of improve on, and we might get to this topic later. It's called screening. And so screening is where people would go in and be screened for like a mammogram or something. And obviously Jackie has a lot of experience in this area, but in effect, screening of mammograms help reduce breast cancer onset in women for a long time. And the incidence of breast cancer, recognition of it, has diminished a lot. And then there's a couple others that are kind of interesting. One is a quality of life trial. I think we have probably 100 or 110 trials currently going on in the Cancer Center. And about half of them are for symptoms that actually occur because you're on a certain kind of drug. So you're involved in sort of taking a different type of an approach to something where you're having a good or bad reaction to a cancer drug. But I think one of the most interesting ones, and the last one, is called a natural history trial. This is a trial in which people are just discussing the natural history of their families, whether it's colon cancer, and that accumulation then goes into the database at the FDA. And just one last quick point. I know there's a perception of clinical trials as being grabbing a patient, but I can tell you from personal experience that there are hundreds of animal trials, cell-based trials, safety trials that go on before you actually appeal to the FDA to get permission to test it in patients. So the stigma about a clinical trial, by the time it gets to a group of people enrolling in clinical trials, it has already been through enormous amount of scrutiny by multiple levels of committees, both at the hospital, at the regional systems, and then of course at the federal government. So a very exciting trial with new innovative things, and not so less painful either. It's but I think that's actually a very good point, and it should be painful to get it through.
Yeah, I think that's a really great overview, because I think not only does it help us understand the range of trials that are out there, the range of studies, that it's not just for people who are sick, that maybe those of us who are healthy can get involved as well and think about how to stay healthy. That's just as important.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Jackie, you have personal experience on the patient side of this process.
Yeah.
So as Eric says, this sounds a little bit clinical. Tell us what it's really like. What made you make the choices that you did to get involved?
When I was diagnosed with breast cancer, it was presented to me through my oncologist and a nurse navigator to be in a research trial for the particular type of cancer I was diagnosed with. And I was just gung-ho. I think for me personally, I knew that being in a trial may not benefit me right now, but down the line, it would benefit somebody else, the most good for the most people. And I was also told that not too many minorities participate in trials. So I was like, oh, well, this is my opportunity, to make a difference, to be a change, to help evolve this type of research so that hopefully it will have a better impact and better outcomes for this type of cancer in the future. So I really wanted to be in the study, really do what I could do. And on the other side of it too, and learning more about it, there were perks that was really advantageous for me for participating in the trial as well. Some of the costs for some of the testing and things that I had to have done were deferred, and the trial actually picked up and incurred those costs where I didn't have to pay out of pocket. So it was a win-win for me.
That's really great to hear about your experience. And we're going to come back over the course of the conversation to talk about some of those aspects of your experience and how maybe we can make changes that make it even better.
Yeah.
But you brought up an important point that I want to shoot over to Holly, which is that you really had this future-facing attitude towards it, knowing that it might not help you, but it can help other people. So Holly, that plays into your expertise in ethics. Can you explain a little bit about the type of issues that you think about before we kind of dig in a little bit deeper?
Yeah, sure. So thanks again for having me remotely. My work focuses on research ethics and the oversight of clinical research. And so the types of things that I'm thinking about have to do with making sure that research participants are well protected, that their rights and interests are being looked out for. And so we can talk about this a bit more as the conversation progresses, but there is a body that is responsible for overseeing research, basically at every institution that conducts research with people, called an institutional review board. And researchers are required to go to that board with their proposals before they're allowed to ask anybody to be in their studies. And they have to convince that board that the risks and benefits are reasonable, that the risks are made as low as possible, and that they will ask people for their permission and explain to them what will happen in the research that they're being asked to join. And so I think a lot about how those institutional review boards oversee research, who sits on those boards, the types of expertise they should have, and whether and how they really are understanding what it's like to be in research from the patient's perspective. There are ways to have both those review boards and the researchers engage with community members to make sure that the types of questions that are being asked are the types of questions that are most important to patients, and to make sure that the patients, really understand what they are becoming involved in, both what are the benefits to them, the risks to them, and the way in which their participation might help those going forward. I've spent a lot of time over the past year thinking about the ethics of research involving COVID treatments and COVID vaccines. Some of the biggest issues that have come up in that context are making sure that we are collaborating and prioritizing the research questions that we ask, because people who agree to participate in research are a really important resource. And so we don't want to ask them to participate in studies unless they are well designed and will be able to answer the questions that they are intending to answer. We don't want to have duplication of too many studies that are too similar. And so there's an important priority setting that needs to go on. And then I also think about how to make it easier for people to enroll in research. And I spend a lot of time thinking about paying people to participate. And so that might be something as simple as, paying them for the time away from work, or so that they can get childcare, or, have their transportation paid for, but also compensating them for the time and effort that they might put into research. And I'm happy to talk about any of that as we proceed in the conversation.
We'll definitely dig into more of those issues as we get into our conversation. But Holly, you mentioned the institutional review board, some of the other safeguards that are in place. And we can't talk about these issues without acknowledging some of the mistreatment and abuse that has taken place in medical research in the past. What's different now? Whether it's these particular safeguards or other practices that are in place?
Sure. Well, so if you think about what's different now, right, we have to say, different compared to when. Those institutional review boards that I mentioned have actually been required by law since the 1970s. And they were a response to public revelations about the Tuskegee syphilis study, in which Black men in the South were followed for the natural history of their syphilis without being told that they were involved in research and actually having effective treatment and care withheld from them. When that study became public, Congress got involved, and Congress required by law that if you got money from the federal government to do research involving human participants, then you needed to make sure that an institutional review board signed off on the research. And then the other thing that Congress did in the 1970s was put together a national commission to evaluate the ethics of research. They wrote a report called the Belmont Report. It's a short little thing. You can Google it. And what those commissioners did was identify 3 overarching principles of research ethics. The first principle is basically respect for persons. And the way that you can respect people is by making sure that you are getting their informed consent and that you're not enrolling people in your research precisely because they are vulnerable. Or if they are vulnerable, that there are protections in place to make sure that there's somebody who can help them understand the research and that their interests are protected. The next principle is it's beneficence. It's kind of a fancy word for just making sure that we are maximizing the benefits to people who participate in research, and also maximizing the value of the research so that their contributions can help the most people. And then the last principle is the principle of justice. And this is the idea that the benefits and burdens of participating in research ought to be fairly distributed across the population, right? So that you are not, particularly enrolling people because they, can't afford good health care or because they are vulnerable to potentially not understanding what they're being asked to engage in. So that Belmont report with those 3 basic principles then supported a set of regulations that those institutional review boards are responsible for checking. With every single protocol that comes in, the researchers have to say, these are the risks and benefits of this research, and they have to, make sure that there's adequate disclosure of information during the consent process, and that people understand that their participation is voluntary, that they can withdraw from the study at any point in time. There's a lot of information that goes into those consent materials, and researchers like me work around trying to make sure that those materials are useful and understandable to the people that they are supposed to inform. Now, more recently, those regulations that have been around for several decades got revised. And one of the most important revisions was to informed consent. And so these forms had gotten pretty long. Jackie can probably tell us more about the consent forms that she was asked to sign when she participated in research. And, you can kind of get overwhelmed with all of this information. And so now the regulations require a summary of key information that a reasonable person would want to know before they decided to participate in research. So those are the regulatory changes. And then I'll be brief here, but the other thing that I wanted to mention is that there's been a lot more attention paid recently to community engagement in research. And what I mean by that is basically an ethical obligation on the part of the researchers to work with the communities that they hope to study, to make sure that they're asking the questions that are most important to those communities, and that they really understand the kind of challenges and barriers that might arise in the course of medical care, in the course of research participation, and then also working with communities to share the benefits and the results of the research. One complaint that you often hear, although thankfully less frequently, is that people agree to participate in research and then they never hear what happens. And so I think that's something that has gotten, much better over the past several years, is that there's been an increased attention to making sure that there's engagement at the point of designing the study, all the way to the point of completing the study and sharing the results.
Yeah, that's a really helpful overview of kind of where the work is happening right now. And that last point that you made around community engagement, I think is where we are at. Exactly. Is that we're here to work with our community here, because this is a really global problem. And Anya, I'll ask you to speak to that in a minute. But we can change things and we can improve things right here in Delaware. And so that's what we'll be talking about tonight. So Anya, last but not least here,
All right.
tell us about your job, because you are right on the front lines of trying to put into place all of these, principles that Holly just described.
Yeah, thanks so much, Gayatri. And this is a fantastic opportunity. The answer lies in the community, but let me talk to you a little bit more specifically about my job. At GSK, my remit is to ensure that our clinical research is representative of the general population. What we try to focus on is to make sure that we understand the demographics of individuals. That means the age of individuals. We want to make sure that we're including older adults as well as our pediatric population. We also want to make sure that we are including men and women. Believe it or not, we still struggle with some of our clinical trials to recruit enough women in them, and as well ethnicity. And so those are the majority of the demographics that we look at. We also want to make sure that we understand societal impact that individuals may have. Do they live in a rural community? This as well makes a difference. So my remit is to make sure that we're incorporating all of this information in our clinical trials. And why is that important? It's important to make sure that we have the completeness of data. So what's fundamental is that we're all a little bit different. And that difference needs to be captured as we're investigating these products that we're trying to develop as medicines and vaccines. And so in order to incorporate that, we need to study it. So from a patient perspective or a population or a community perspective, individuals want to know that they're participating in the development of a medicine. It's an altruistic approach, actually. You can describe it that way. And from a societal perspective, I think that's where a lot of the power is. It's that collective impact. From a scientific perspective, again, we need to make sure that we have the completeness of the data. So this way we understand when molecules behave a little bit different. We know, for example, some seizure medications actually can cause rashes in certain groups of individuals and not in other individuals. We won't know that unless we study that larger group of population. Some blood pressure medications like beta blockers, they will behave more, they will work better in some populations and not as well in other populations. And again, if we don't study that, we won't have that information as we're developing these medicines. So that's what my job is about at GSK. And just moving towards having the community impact helps us to have that solution, because we need to make sure that individuals know why it's so important to participate in a clinical trial. With Jackie, it seemed like it was pretty straightforward. Many individuals, it's a barrier, or they're very fearful, or they feel like they're a guinea pig. And so for many of those reasons, we need to make sure that we come in this community environment, make sure that we understand what those barriers are, have that dialogue so that all individuals can feel as comfortable as Jackie felt.
And also to have the choice to not participate in this as well,
Absolutely
right?
Right.
Recognizing that, that the more information you have, the better choice you can make for your own health. But I think you raised a really good point in terms of all of the different kinds of diversity that affects our health, at a physical and mental level. Right? It's not just, that our bodies are different, our environments are different, our social supports are different. And when we think about, trials for, maintaining health or preventing disease, I think one other thing we've really made a lot of advancement in is understanding all of those other factors that go into influencing our health.
Correct.
So now that you've gotten to know our panelists and the expertise that they bring in, the experience that they come with, we hope you'll join the conversation. Please send us your questions. We'll answer them as many as we can on air. If you're watching on social media, you can drop your questions in the comments. If you're watching on TV, you can send us a note on email, just email speakerseries@fi.edu. And we'd love to hear what's on your mind. So I'll start by asking our panel some questions to get a little bit more about how the research is designed. Some of you touched on that in thinking about the process by which some of the safeguards are in place. But Eric, maybe I'll start with you in terms of, like, if you were to design a trial, how do you think about safety?
Well, I think that's what we have to think about initially. Even though it sort of gets lost in translations a lot of time, medicine is to do no harm. And while the FDA has sort of set up guidelines that Holly did a fantastic job really explaining before it gets there, and I just as an aside, I think she described something very important and everybody should know. Holly's sitting at the same table I am as we discuss this. So you have patient advocates, you have brilliant ethicists like Holly, you have people making sure that the trials that we move forward on, the science move forward, is in fact ethical. And that is run by every legitimate institution that goes before the FDA. So, but in terms of thinking about the safety side, generally it's built on what has come before. So dosing information is published, everything is in the public domain. And initially, the trials were designed into phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and essentially phase 1 was a limited number of people who basically would volunteer and would get low doses of the biotherapeutic or the drug you were testing. And very quickly, people would be monitoring their health and their well-being. And if it were something like a prevention trial, if you go on the Peloton or you ride a bike for 2 hours, immediately your blood pressure would be taken, and so there was a standard met there. But recently the FDA has kind of begun to merge safety and efficacy. So if things look pretty safe, they don't want to hold people back. So safety is absolutely the first concern. The trials are designed based on what has come before, that have made good dosages and things like that. But then efficacy begins to enter into it. And so you'll sometimes see clinical trials built on phase 1, phase 2, or phase 1A or phase 1B. And I think those are the kind of interesting things. And again, to Holly's point, things have really been heavily regulated to protect the patient, because even at Christiana, where our attitude is, the patient comes first, not the technology. And so that attitude is what you said. It's about the environment, about the holistic care. Where does the patient live and what can best serve them? So all of the factors you described actually go into our thinking about whether or not this will be a safe use in humans.
So if all goes well, it gets tested in larger
Right.
and larger numbers of patients. Hopefully, you see that successful result, that it makes a difference, and then you can put it into practice. What happens when you find a result that doesn't go the way you hope, Anya?
Well, then you begin to try to delve into it and understand, well, why did it go the way that you didn't expect? That challenges your hypothesis, right? And so maybe you go back and you look at some of the basic research that was conducted and make sure that you didn't miss something. And then you further understand exactly, maybe there was an adverse event, maybe there was a lack of efficacy, as Eric mentioned, but you need to just try to delve in a little bit more to understand that. So you won't necessarily go with that clinical development plan that you had initially set up. You may pause it a little bit, but the bottom line is that information is just as valuable,
right,
as if it went in the direction that you wanted to, because the bottom line is we want to make sure that we're developing the best medicines for our patients. So if it doesn't go that right way, we stop and we make sure we try to understand what exactly happened.
I can add just one more thing there. I can interject. Anya's mentioned something very important, in that it is experimental medicine. And occasionally there will be things where someone doesn't report a comorbidity, or they've had something they forget. And sometimes
that might be a pre-existing
it would be a
condition.
pre-existing
Right.
condition. And of
Right.
course, we all know, I think we're getting to a point where we all recognize how important those are, both for insurance reasons and things like that. But it's very important to be very transparent as you enter into a clinical trial enrollment, to let the people know this is going to happen. But I think it's also maybe a question for Holly and Anya as well. I suspect, I've heard that if in some of the COVID vaccine trials, that people would die of a heart attack and they'd have to stop the trial because that person actually was on the clinical trial and stopped. So even though they had nothing to do with the vaccine, So that's really at a level that is so particular that everybody is watching this so carefully that if there's any adverse effects begin, I mean, at GSK, they have a great team of people who watch this, that the trial is stopped. So even if there's any hint of something that may be going wrong, they slow the trial down very carefully so they ensure safety first. So it's a very good point that you have to go back, but trials can be stopped in reaction to someone who forgot to mention they had a heart attack 10 years ago and weren't really qualified to be on the trial. So sometimes it may seem that trials get stopped because the drug is wrong or the vaccine is wrong, but it's not that. It's just that something happened in the process, and that's what you find out when you stop the trial and go back and dig.
Sure.
So the important point is, any hint that something might be wrong, stop the trial, figure out what's
and
going
it happens.
on.
Absolutely.
And that happens
It
frequently.
happens. Yep.
Jackie,
There's also
from a patient's perspective, how did you feel in terms of thinking about the safety of the trial that you participated in?
One thing that I really liked about the trial and my nurse navigators, if there was something adverse that happened or a certain side effect that they started to see more and more, they would bring me in, they would have me review the consent again, and they would actually put in that new side effect as one of the things that I would have to watch for. So they were very transparent throughout the whole trial. And they did that with me maybe 2 or 3 times because there were some side effects that they were, or untoward effects they were seeing that they wanted me to be aware of and everybody that was on the trial. So they would bring me in, bring the consent. They would say, these are the new signs and symptoms to be wary of. These have been indicated. So this is it became part of my 26-page, now 27-page consent. But like I said, they were very transparent, very straightforward. And if anything happened, they brought me right in to make me aware.
So you're really seeing the science in real time.
Oh, absolutely. I'm like seeing all of this come into fruition because it actually occurred and it didn't just start, it's already underway. So I felt very safe throughout the whole trial.
Yeah. So I want to kind of touch on that with connecting it back to Holly. You talked about thinking about the risks and benefits and how we think about the greater good versus for the community, for the future versus the potential benefits and risks for the individual. Can you talk a little bit about how we think about that balance?
Sure. And let me also just add a few points on safety that I should have mentioned before. So a couple of other things to keep in mind. Those institutional review boards that are looking at the research proposals before they get launched also are overseeing the studies as they proceed. They are required to review the studies on at least an annual basis to make sure that the ethics are still reasonably appropriate. But if there are any what are called adverse events, basically safety concerns that happen in the study, those are getting reported to the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, and those the members of those boards will look at those adverse events and they will say, we're seeing a concerning pattern here. We want to see additional safety measures put in, or they'll say, oh, that one is not actually related to the trial. There was something else going on with that participant. There's also another type of committee called a data safety monitoring board. In many studies, the researchers actually shouldn't be peeking at the data as they're being collected, because that might change how they interact with the research participants. It might actually change the results. Not intentionally, just kind of by virtue of knowing how things are going in the study, they might start to think, oh, this intervention is better than that one, even before all of the data are gathered. And so the researchers aren't necessarily looking at the data, but these data safety monitoring committees, which are often comprised of statisticians who are looking at the statistics, ethicists, other researchers and clinical experts will look at the data as they're coming in. And if it starts to look like there's a concerning safety pattern in the data, then they will have what are called stopping rules. And they'll say, look, you need to stop this study. Or they might see that the intervention is working. One intervention is working better than the other. And they might be able to decide that sooner than they had expected. And so they can stop the study because they know one of the interventions is better than the other. So there are kind of lots of different entities that are responsible for overseeing this work. Now, the risks and benefits of research, that's really the core of what the work that I do is, right? It's thinking about when can we ask people to take on uncertainty for the benefit of scientific progress, right? Now think about, COVID is a great example, right? We didn't know at the beginning of this new virus how to treat people. We didn't know how to prevent it. We didn't know, about a lot of the public health interventions, how effective they would be. And so we needed to study those things. Now, the important thing to keep in mind is that when you're asked to participate in a research study, the interventions that you might be offered, they're offered because we don't actually know if they're better or worse than the alternative. You might be offered, the standard treatment, right? What you would be offered if you were not in the study, or you might be offered some experimental intervention. That experimental intervention could be a drug that's been approved for another disease and now they want to try it in this one, or it could be something that hasn't been FDA approved for anything at all, right? It's a brand new product. But the analysis that gets done is that it's reasonably safe and that it's reasonably uncertain which of those interventions is going to be better than the other one. If we didn't do research in a really rigorous fashion and people weren't willing to participate in research, then we wouldn't be able to get important answers about how best to treat people with different diseases or how to prevent different diseases. And instead, what would happen would be that your doctor would have to make guesses about what would be beneficial for you. And those guesses could actually have risks associated with them. And so I worry sometimes that people think, oh, research is so risky. But if we don't do the research, then the regular practice of medicine could be risky. And as I mentioned, there are lots of interventions or mechanisms to oversee the safety of research participants. That doesn't mean that there are no risks, of course, and that would be something that would be very carefully disclosed to research participants before they make a decision about whether to be in the study. The other thing that I want to flag, right, is that you might just be comparing two things or more than two things that are already being used in the course of clinical care, right? So you might have a group of physicians who say, for people who have this disease, I really prefer this intervention. And you might have another group of physicians who say, no, I prefer this other one. You're not sure, right, which of them are better. And so there's a lot of research that gets done that's called comparative effectiveness research, where you're taking two things that are already happening in routine care and you're comparing them to one another so that you can have more certainty about how best to care for people. So I don't want people to think all research is extremely risky because you're giving people new drugs that have never been tested in people before. There are studies like that. But as was mentioned at the outset, there's a wide variety of different types of research, some of which is very low risk and some of which is more, moderate risk. But those risks will be balanced by the potential benefits either to the research participants or benefits of learning, what the best treatments are going to be for future patients.
I think that's also a really important point there, this, thinking about risks and benefits together. Right, you don't want to have something that is, relatively low benefit but high risk. But at the same time, when you're thinking about cancer, then there's a different risk calculus involved, and that's a decision that the researchers are making, that ethicists are making, and each of us would be making as we choose to participate or not. So, we've been talking about how COVID has really brought a lot of awareness to this process. I think one other thing, if any of us have, had a telehealth medicine or, tried something different during the pandemic, we were also seeing that there are new ways, new technologies, new methodologies that are emerging in order to make it easier for people to participate. And Anya, maybe you could speak to what are the different approaches that we're trying to, make it maybe like less important to have to go to a hospital every time?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jayatri. What we're trying to do, again, is focus on the patient. And I think COVID really has accelerated a lot of these efforts. The approach that we're calling it is decentralized clinical trials, And so with that, we try to make sure we understand what is it that we're doing that's overly burdensome to the patient. So with that, we might be able to utilize wearables. So technology that the individual that's participating in a clinical trial can actually wear at home and maybe measure their pulse, maybe measure their oxygen level, maybe measure their mobility. So that's an assessment that can be done at home. Another approach with that may be part of that decentralized clinical trial approach is having nurses come to your home and do the assessment there. So this way you don't have the burden of perhaps going to a hospital or a clinic. As well, telemedicine. So you may not be wearing a wearable, or you may not have the nurse come, but you'll be able to dial in through a link and be able to speak to the investigator virtually. So these are multiple technologies that we're trying to utilize in order to make sure that our protocol, the whole process, is not overly burdensome, that it'll wear a patient out, or maybe convince them to drop out of the clinical trial. But the bottom line is just trying to keep them in focus. What's not so technologically savvy, but just as relevant, and we're all trying to do more so, is bringing the voice of the patient into the clinical trial. So we do that as we're developing the protocol. We actually have patient panels, and we'll go over maybe a first draft of a protocol. We'll get their input. Do we have too many assessments? Is it way too onerous? Is it too far? Are some of the studies too intrusive or invasive? So we creating the protocols not really going to recognize that level of burden, but having patients or lay individuals come in and read that protocol provides that assistance. So it's not technology, but it's the voice of the patient, and it really helps us to get it right.
That's such an interesting part of the process that we haven't touched on yet. How would you get involved in that?
That's a challenge, right?
For somebody who might be interested in playing that role.
Sure. So what we try to do is we collaborate with patient organizations, and we'll share with the patient organization that this is a desire of ours to be able to do that, because there's such large bodies of individuals that have a common disease. That's one way. We may advertise, we may put it on our website that this is an approach that we're doing. But the patient organization is the most popular way that we can reach out to individuals, let them know that this is what we're doing, and invite them in.
So that's a great network to tap into if you are part of a patient organization. That's something that you could potentially ask about. I want to throw a question out from Betsy Price, who asked this on Facebook. We talked about underlying conditions before. Do most trials insist that you have to be completely healthy to participate? Looking at Eric here.
No, in fact, I think that's, we anticipate that there are sort of secondary things that happen. I mean, we have a program advancing towards sickle cell disease. The genetic medicine has given us hope that we might be able to at least successfully treat that disease by fixing the mutation that causes that. And unfortunately, sickle cell patients have a lot of other conditions associated with it. There's a bias and a tendency in the scientific community. Well, there used to be, I think this has changed, in that we see the disease as part of the gene and not as part of the patient, as Anya was talking about. So we don't anticipate that at all. And in fact, most patients probably have multiple types of comorbidities. We call it a fancy word for other things that are bothering them, or the diseases. Many AIDS patients died of fungal infections because their immune system was so badly suppressed. They didn't really die of the virus, although that predisposed them to do it. So again, as long as there's, transparency in that, you won't be excluded from that. You could very easily be put into this trial, but I think Holly touched on this. There's so much interaction going on that GSK may be running a trial, and they have a cadre of patients who aren't really qualifying, but they'll call ChristianaCare, and ChristianaCare says, we have a trial these people will fit into. And at ChristianaCare, every month, there's a monthly meeting that goes on. I've seen Jackie there, and there's a report on every single trial that's enrolling, and people are very, very sensitive. Some trials are waiting for enrollment. Some trials don't get enough patients, and they wait until someone from GSK or Pfizer or University of Pennsylvania will alert us there are patients who might qualify for your trial. So the network and the information is very tight. And if you have something that won't make you qualify for a trial at Penn, could very easily go to GSK or to ChristianaCare. So I think there is a trial for everyone out
So
there.
that's something else that people can be knowledgeable about.
Absolutely.
Jackie, did you have any issues to think about on that front in terms of being able to choose between trials, or was this particular trial presented to you as the one that was the best fit for your particular condition?
This, I learned this trial was particular to my diagnosis. I was diagnosed with triple negative breast cancer. So that's what the study was. And there are other types of breast cancers, but it was that particular one. And what I learned, is, even doing my own research, is that certain trials, you have to meet the criteria to be a participant in that trial. And if you don't, there may be another opportunity at another time.
So I wanted to follow up on something that you mentioned, when you were first getting to know you. You mentioned the role that a nurse navigator played.
Yes.
And I would like to ask you to describe this a little bit more, because we've heard from Holly, there's so many regulations in place. We've heard from Anya, there are so many safety protocols in place, so many different, people involved. It can seem kind of overwhelming, right?
Yes.
So tell us about how a nurse navigator helped you through this.
I won't mention her name, but my nurse navigator became like my best friend. She was phenomenal. So one of the roles of the nurse navigator is, once you enroll in one of these trials and you get through the consent form and the paperwork and everything, they're like your best friend. You can call them for anything. They come to every visit that you have. They're there in the when you're in the room getting when you're getting your physical or whatever that you have to have or go through. They're there with you every bit of the way. They'll hold your hand. They'll answer any questions you have. Like even if I had something outside of what was going on that I wanted to find out related to my particular cancer, they would get you answers to any questions that you proposed or had. They were call me even at home if you have any other questions. If you can't get in touch with the on-call doctor, if something's going on, call me, and they would help facilitate your care every step of the way. It's almost like they became an integral part of my family. Like if I knew if I couldn't reach someone on my cancer care team, I could always just pick up the phone and call this individual any time of the day or the night, and they were there. And you got an answer. So that I always felt safe and secure in knowing that there was a nurse navigator available. There was one personally assigned to me and everybody that came through the program that was in a research study. And like I say, they became more of a best friend or a family member. And I don't really think I would have done as well without that individual, because it was like a safety net, a support that I knew I had. And it just made me feel more reassured in going through this process that was perilous enough that I was going to be okay. I really felt safe, even with the confidence that the navigator had and giving me support. It was amazing.
And having someone who was looking out for you.
Yes, that definitely, totally looking out for me.
So on that note, we've got another question from Betsy. If you join a trial, can you quit it if you just don't like being in it, or are there certain criteria that allow you to drop out? Maybe I'll throw that to Holly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is very clear. You have the right to withdraw from a study at any time for any reason at all or for no reason at all. And that's something that would that's actually required in the relevant regulations. It's something that should be discussed with research participants when or people who are considering becoming research participants during the consent process. The decision to be in the study in the first place is totally voluntary, and you can leave the study at any time. Now, if you decide that you want to leave the study, the researchers and the research staff might say, it would be helpful if we could continue to follow up with regard to safety, or, these are things to look out for. If you are in a drug trial, for example, there might be safety concerns if you abruptly stop the medication. And so there might be some kind of additional wraparound things that need to happen when you decide to leave. But that is completely within the rights of research participants to walk away at any time.
Thanks, Holly. No, I think that's really helpful, again, just to
Absolutely.
know what all of your options are.
Yes.
As we start to wrap this up, I want to leave people with some helpful advice. One of the challenges that I think has come up in a theme in some of our conversations as we were preparing for this event was the idea of communication. We've all heard a lot of information about the idea of research and the idea of clinical trials. We talked a little bit about direct action that you can take to try and get involved by working with a patient group. But how can we do better at helping people know what's available and what they can get involved in? And Eric, maybe I'll throw that question to you first.
Well, I think the fact we're sitting at DETV is a good start.
Mhm.
Because I think that through the years, we have tried to communicate with people of color, minority groups, underserved populations in sort of the standard way. And with Ivan Thomas and DETV is a spectacular vehicle for us to get into the community. Number one, because, and I've worked with Ivan on another project, that there is trust that has been built up, that the quality of the DETV production would essentially wouldn't be here unless the community was accepting in this as a vehicle. And you and I, Geoffrey, have worked together on other projects. And so when we started thinking about doing this, I was so happy that you said, this is the vehicle we need to do it with. So I think the message is not just reaching out. Everybody reaches out. We want to reach out, but it's really how you reach out that is important. And I think that's changing. I mean, we have a production going on with DETV on sickle cell anemia, and how is it that new technologies can affect that in some ways. The fact that we're working with DETV on that production is different than we might have done that 3 or 4 years ago. We might have gone to a standard production company, but because they're embedded in this community, they have the trust of this community, and they're providing information to them, I think speaks volumes to the progress we're making. We have to do more, but I like to focus on not only the message we're giving, but how we're delivering it and finding new ways to do that, because we all want the same thing. I mean, all these people, Jackie's my hero. And it's amazing, this woman's life. It's been hard to sit here. I'm sinking lower sitting next to her, but I think she's a hero. And I think getting Jackie out in front of people to talk about her story and what she's done, it's how we deliver the message, and rather than just kind of the same old vehicles. I think that will begin to penetrate that long needed interaction.
And Jackie, you're out there talking to folks.
Yes.
What questions do you hear from people?
Actually, surprisingly enough, from a lot of minority groups that I've talked to, they want to know how to get into research
Right,
studies.
yes.
I mean, you guys want to know how to get them in, and they want to know how to get in. Like,
we gotta do better and bring people together.
what do I need to do? Who do I talk to? That's what I find out a lot when I give talks to different groups.
I think that's a really exciting opportunity for us, because I think our discussion today hopefully has touched on this, that research can be a part of health, that we don't have to only have these conversations in a doctor's office.
Correct.
Right.
So, leave us comments. Where do you talk about health? Where do you get together with other people who might be interested in thinking and learning together about how research is part of all of the solutions that we think about? I want to end on thinking about why this discussion is so important now. This has been an issue for so long in terms of advancing research. But Eric, it's just kind of coming back to where you started, is that there's research happening today for which understanding the diversity of people and health is crucially important.
Right. It's really arisen out of the change we have in the development of drugs is always going to be essential. Pharmaceuticals will always be important, but there is an opportunity to treat inherited diseases by using genetic medicine to educate the cell to repair itself. And we have now a couple of tools in our hands to do that. And so the underlying DNA sequence of individuals, and Anya beautifully mentioned how different we really are, that's actually reflected at the level of the DNA. And the sad news is, over the course of probably the last 20 years, we have had almost no advancement in the deposition of DNA sequences from the African American community or from the Latino community. And so what we end up with is developing wonderful genetic medicines that are based on the databases we have and the information we have, which are European Caucasians. So we need to desperately not only get more people to engage in clinical trials, but also to just donate samples so we can expand our database, so we can develop drugs and genetic medicine for a wider diversity. And that's really what has come about, I think, because of the evolution of these new genetic tools. It taught us that we all are slightly different. And a drug, although targeted therapies are very specific and change from person to person. So as we get more sophisticated and more precise in precision medicine with our drugs and our treatments, we actually need to know and gain a bigger database of many different diverse communities so that we can now develop tools and genetic medicine that will affect everyone equally. And I think that's been a rude awakening, frankly, for the scientific community.
Anya, did you want to add to that in terms of some of the things that you're seeing coming down the pike?
Yeah, it's the focus on the patient and understanding the uniqueness and making sure that we develop molecules that can address those unique aspects of individuals. So this is a great time to be in medicine. Great advantages for our patients. We just need to make sure that we're getting that information out there. So what you all are doing here is fantastic. I'm happy to be part of it. We need to do more of it.
I think that's something that I reflect on a lot, is that, all of us are the same in so many ways, but it's the little things that make us different that can make a big difference in our health. And with the technology that we have today, we're better able to target those little differences.
Right.
But at the end of the day, we're still all on the same team. That, there's so many of us who are thinking about everybody's health, thinking about keeping everybody healthy together. And I think the conversation that we've had tonight is just a start on thinking about how we bring all of these perspectives together. So with that, I want to share a comment from Lossie Freeman, which I love. Such an important topic tonight. Thanks to DETV for this relevant and quality programming, and thank you to your guests. So I couldn't have said it any better. This is just the start of this conversation. By working with ChristianaCare, with DETV, we hope that this is a conversation that will continue. We have a survey on our website where we'd love to get your thoughts as you learn more about this. Just go to fi.edu/medical-research-survey. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on what you're learning, what you're thinking, and how we can move forward together. I'd like to give another big thanks to all of our panelists, to Holly joining us remotely, and to all of you who are joining us for this important conversation tonight. Thank you, stay healthy, and we hope we'll keep seeing you in the future.